And I'm saying, where you have conflicting ideas about the participation of the army in national politics, where you strongly believe that the army should not participate in partisan politics, and where the army strongly believes, because of its history, that they are supposed to participate in partisan politics, then we have conflicting ideas that call for national dialogue. That's why I was saying, let's sit down, let's forget about the 2013 constitution, because this was a negotiated constitution between two political parties. Let's have an all-inclusive constitution-making process where we say these are our realities. This is the national army that we have. This is what we expect. Do we want our army to be modeled along the Chinese or Singaporean model, or we want it to be along the British American model? Then we sit down and we agree. But we should involve those that are in the army in those discussions, so that we come with a document, we come with a position that both the citizens and those in the uniformed forces are going to respect. But if we have those outside the security sector coming up with laws that would ostracize a whole section of a society, we are creating problems for ourselves.
Guys, welcome to Ruby Uncensored, and thank you so much, guys, for passing through. If it is your first time to come across this channel, I'm going to ask you to subscribe. Make sure that you ring the bell so that every time I'm live or I drop a video, you'll be notified immediately. And I also want to send out my love to my regular subscribers and say, stick around, we're going to have the best time today. Please take a listen.
Ostalos, yeah, if you can go to the way forward and conclusion.
Thank you very much. There was a question which speaks to the way forward. What is it that we assist with? Let me first thank fellow citizens for coming into this important space. It was my genuine belief, it was our genuine belief that we ought to have this feedback look with our people, so that people are knowledgeable about what is happening in the alternative. We moved from being an opposition to an alternative, because an opposition will just be opposing. An alternative has to offer an alternative governance agenda to the people of Zimbabwe. I must say that our struggle remains an effort of genuine democratic leaders who believe this country deserves a change, but a change that is not just for the benefit of people in the Triple C, but for every Zimbabwean. We ought to look at politics as the conveyor belts of the aspirations of ordinary people, regardless of the political jackets that they are wearing. Because what ZANU-PF has done for the past 30 years was to attempt to bastardize political conversations and introduce this binary thing of labeling and hate and so forth, to the level and extent that we lose the sense of the fact that we are all Zimbabweans. We want to build a society that benefits everyone. Let's have an economy that works for every Zimbabwean. I mean, it's sad. I had a conversation with one of the elders that traveled with Anos Tete to Dubai. There was a trip that was organized to Dubai for the elders on the Father's Day. And I talked to one of the elders who came to my inbox saying, look, I went with Tilda to Dubai. And I came back saying, you know what, guys, we are old enough, we rather die in the streets fighting, because I did not travel. When I went to Dubai, I realized that we are playing. And I said, but Mdara, do you know that when we got independence, Dubai was a desert? And when you ask the people in Dubai, what is the difference? They tell you that it is stewardship. It is stewardship. You can have privileges for the elites. You can have cars for MPs and ministers. When people have water, when people have food, when people have basic access to health, because the resources in this country are so much that everyone can benefit from the resources of our country, regardless of their political aspirations and political belonging. That is the society that we must build. It's a tolerant society. It's painful for a lot of people. You know that in the opposition, as it was constructed for the past 20 years, The reason why we want to build an alternative is that, and the reason why some of us want to also run away from responsibility is that a political responsibility creates in individuals and people. And I'm now speaking into the way forward. One of our biggest responsibility we have now from going forward is building a credible alternative. And when I say a credible alternative, I mean that we have to do the following. Number one, we assist with the task of think tanking around building an institution. Because what happened, I listened to one of the leaders, I wouldn't mention his name now, but one of our elders in the MDC then when we were in the youth, when you listened to him speak, you would agree with Zamchia that what it became also in the opposition is what it became in ZANU-PF, is that people developed a creeping sense of entitlement and the culture of impunity. I can abuse so and no one must question me because I was there in 99. So you ought to persist and genuinely, at least for those who are genuine about the removal of ZANU, you ought to understand that we have to build a credible alternative. President Chamisa must lead a credible team that ought to make sure that one, they're an alternative to ZANU-PF, but more importantly, they ready themselves to go and govern. It must not be labored on those that communicate about the character of the organization. It must be there. It must not be ontological. It must be touchable. It must be felt by every citizen that there people are now serious about their agenda to govern. That is our preoccupation. What is what is the way forward around building that credible alternative? It speaks to the question that was raised by my brother Postike. Zimbabwe is a securocratic state. And those that have been involved in democratic opposition for the past 20 plus years know that you have to unlock the gridlock that has been a problem in Zimbabwe. Many people think that the problem is that the opposition has not been in power because it has lost election. That is fundamentally flawed and wrong. Because the problem in Zimbabwe is blocked transitions. We've got transitions that have been checked halfway, both the 2008, the 2018, 2018, and 2023. All these blocked transition locate the military as the decisive power block in the Zimbabwean questions of transition. So, in the process of building an alternative, Democrats and all progressive Zimbabweans ought to understand and devise mechanisms and methods to deal with this element in the room to ensure that we resolve the questions of transition, because people have done well in dealing with questions of winning power. But the key questions of the future of governance in this country must be about how do you, after attaining power, make sure that you foster and lead society towards a democratic breakthrough and a transition. So that is the elephant in the Zimbabwean body politic that we are confronted with. And you ought to understand, and we've articulated our policy around the role of the securocrats. It's a very sensitive space, but it's important for citizens to understand. We've articulated, because if you look at the reality of this country, is that securocrats are meant and used to hold the power on behalf of a political elites. A political elite, for example, the securocrats played a key role in internal transition of ZANU-PF. When Mnangagwa was defeated in ZANU by the so-called G40, it took the Securocrats to intervene and foster a transition in ZANU-PF. What that means is that people ought to understand, but when political elites now use these players, they go back to their default fascist family, parasitic extractive models. That's why you see Chivios coming in now. They are benefiting from the efforts of other people. That's why you see all these, and they're spending money like they're made, because it's money that is not worked for, which is the problem about corrupt societies and dictatorships, is that you don't create a culture. If you listen to young people, most young people now, they've got this expectation that we must follow Mbinga, praise him and bootlick him so that we get money. ZANU has bastardized a culture of hard work, that you just have to emerge with millions of money without working. We were taught when we were young in the left that There must not be wealth without labor. There must be clarity. That's why it is a workers' struggle. It is the effort of the working people. That's why we believe that the workers must own the means of production because they are working for it and they have to own the means of production for the benefit of every citizen. So the future has to have a conversation about how do we resolve, because if you look at the standards, the living standards of the soldiers in this country, the police force, all of them are getting a salary below poverty datum line, but they get this drilling. If you look at even Rakashi, their role is to going into the airport and singing and praising someone who has stolen wealth that must be shared equally amongst the Zimbabweans. There's zero culture of accountability in this country. To us, we problematize the Zimbabwean question in the two respects. One, a lack of accountability in the Zimbabwean society. Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is not accountable. Chigumba is so arrogant as if he owns the commission and he's not held to account. If you listen to Chiva, you are called by an anti-corruption commission, but look at their response on social media as an arrogant, entitled position. The second problem is that of equity. Our country has got a tiny element of people who are rich and the majority that is poor. I talked about data of millions of Zimbabweans that are food insecure, that are going to need interventions of government. What does NPF give them? They give them slogans. What do they give them? Tired nationalist rhetoric of the liberation struggle. That these are white people have never participated in any process about sanctions. We've pronounced ourselves on sanctions. That one, sanctions in this country must go. But for sanctions to go, there's a procedure that must be done. We've pronounced ourselves on that. That the process of ending sanctions and Zimbabwe's international isolation is not hiring more sangomas and street kids to go and sing in the American embassy. It is simple, it's written down. There is a document of Congress. We ought to look at the issues that they raise and our position as a country. It's the same way we are going to deal with the debt problem in this country. It's not a question of hiring more prophets. It's a question of dealing decisively and more scientifically with the problem that our country is facing. Even a Chamisa government, if Chamisa becomes the president tomorrow, sanctions will not go. We have to, our country have to go to the process and end Zimbabwe's isolation, not only in that part of the country, but even in the EU and so forth. How do we rejoin the Community of Nations? It's a program that government has to be frank about, and obviously it's only an alternative that can be able to deal with these issues. The third element I want to talk about on the way forward was asked by someone, particularly Cooksman, and asked by also, I think, my other sister who talked about what is it that has to be done. I think Dr. Ranga again also asked that question. I think that the problem that our society faces is that ZANU for the past decades has instilled fear on ordinary people. Mugabe, when he created the Central Intelligence Organization, their role was to instill fear that Mugabe is ubiquitous. You can't question power. Even if you are in a committee omnibus, you can't say anything bad about your government because someone in a suit and black shirts is going to pick you up. So Zimbabweans became scared and afraid. So in that respect, we suspended our constitutional right as enshrined in Section 59 to petition and to demonstrate. Because what at the end of the day matters in Zimbabwe is that Zimbabweans ought to, as a people, we ought to take responsibility about our destiny. Political parties are electioneering vehicle. Political parties are created to go into an election, to attain political power. So what happens is that you campaign, once you campaign, you go into an election. When you win, then you govern. If you don't win, you ought to say what are the zones of autonomy that we have. Where in the cities we go and govern. In parliament, we hold government to account. But more importantly, we also then to make sure that in the 5 years you are preparing for the next election. But that is the purpose of a political party. But because ZANU-PF killed the trade union also because this trade union unemployment tricked in. So the role of the trade union, the labor, the civic spaces, and pressure groups has always been to hold that go into government to account. But that obligation because ZANU destroyed all these spaces, destroyed the labor, compromised the progressive voices, the church, and instilled fear in society to the extent that people would rather sit down and start to say, what are you doing, Chamisa? When there are people who claim to be in government, whom we must be asking to say, look, you said to the people you are going to build 1 million houses. Where are the 1 million houses? You said you committed this, because we ought to look at those who have attained power, whether legally or otherwise. They ought to be accountable to ordinary people. Political parties ought to prepare and make sure that they correct their mistakes, which is another point I'm going to talk about. So, but there was ZANU PF under Mugabe deliberately killed this, and the 20 class of 2017 then also became very decisive that we took power from Mugabe through a demonstration, and the resolution was that we must not allow any demonstration in this country. If you look at Honorable Sikala, committed to say, look, we're going to participate in street action. But many people, and it is not their fault. You ought to understand, when people were called upon to demonstrate at that time, most people could not show up in town because Israeli made tankers were then put in towns, cities, and everywhere because the regime invested in taking power from the people. So any program of action that is to dominate the Zimbabwean body politic ought to speak about how do you return power to the people so that everyone who's in office, whether in opposition and government, ought to be holding accountable by people who have put those people in offices, right? That is what must happen. So ZANU poisoned this. How do we intend to resolve it as an alternative? For us, the solution is going to be investing so much on political education. If we don't go back to the basics of political consciousness, we are going to be stuck in this rut of Zimbabwean difficult and painful cycles of block transition. We ought to conscientize our people so that politics and activism does not become a prison for few people that are said to be courageous, but it become a preserve of every citizens, beginning in local spaces where citizens are. That culture was killed. If you listen to, I was listening to this very arrogant chief, you tremble listening to that chief. Zero accountability, hubris, arrogance, and everything. The culture of accountability has been killed, and our people are petrified. Our people are scared. In 2018, people came out to record that displeasure. What followed after? People were shot, and armed citizens were shot by live bullets by men and women in military fatigue. A report was done, a commission was set, nothing happened. In fact, people who were said to be at the center were then promoted to the rank and file of the securocracy in this country. So that is the sad reality of our country. So we must go back to the basics and reconscientize our people so that we can have a critical mass that is sufficient to foster a transition. I've attempted to speak around our role. So we are preoccupied about that. And that process will require us to have proper think tanking processes. Think tanking processes are good for one reason. You don't have to hold a Twitter space to talk about the mistakes that the organization did. You call progressive people and say, look, this is the election. We do an evaluation of the people always ask, for example, me to say, when they say you're defending the organization, there are three loyalties that we were taught when we were in the youth assembly of the opposition. One, you must be loyal to your country. It is undisputed, non-negotiable, not debatable that your first loyalty is loyal to the country. Second is loyalty to the organization and the cause. That whatever happens, remain loyal to the organization and the cause. And more importantly, because the cause has a vision, and because there is a vision, there must be a visionary, and you ought to be loyal to the visionary. So that's why the triple loyalties that were taught when we were young. That's why when we go out there, we defend our country, we defend our institution, we defend our leaders. That is our how we were taught, and that's how we were brought up. And we have not dispute about that kind of teaching and orientation. And we believe that we must remain in that particular pathway unless the people think otherwise. And people who then lose debate, who then want to say, no, 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 they are bootlickers. They are not only, that's not the case. When you are in an organization, you are given an opportunity to present your views. We most of the times we differ with the leadership of the party, in particular president. We differ with in many things. One example I will give: when the party made resolutions about certain interventions, we raised it unequivocally to say we're not in agreement with this particular direction. But what a disciplined cadre of an organization has to do, because when you belong to a collective, you ought to stick, whether painful, whether unagreeable. Once a position is been made by the organization, even if you disagree with you have to stick to that organization or exercise of freedom of the association and say, look, this is a principled position for me and I'm taking a different pathway. But what you can't do is that you have got a platform internally to express yourself. Then you make it fashionable, revolutionary, or to some people, they want to make it academic, to say you are not an academic enough if you don't go to a Twitter space and criticize the organization. So, what is the purpose of the internal infrastructure that has been set for us to express ourselves? So, I'm saying this in short that going forward, we assist with a genuine and authentic evaluation, what we are calling the raw data, to collect the data beyond the full glare of the public. What went wrong, what went correct. One of the greatest attributes of true leadership is acknowledging your mistakes, whether publicly or privately. You ought to know. In 2018, like I said, we had so many successes. One, we had parliament, with local authorities, President Chamisa won. Those three critical victories for me are important. President Chamisa won the presidency. Citizens voted, despite that there were no ballot papers in Arad, there were no ballot papers in Manikali, there were no ballot papers in Bulawayo. People voted for President Chamisa. They stayed in queues the whole night. We documented all this. It is there. People stayed in all night and still gave President Chamisa a mandate to govern. But they didn't stop there. They gave our people a mandate in rural circuit. They gave our people a mandate in rural Cholocho, in Matopo, in Lupane, in Binga. They gave our people a mandate in parliament. But they didn't just give our people mandate, they gave us quality leadership. I'm one of the people who were fans of the faces that were in parliament under the Triple C. ZANU-PF, on the other hand, had people who were carrying flask of coffee, drinking coffee in every 2 hours. I asked one of these MPs and say, Honorable, from Chego to there. I say, but you, Ndara, you were very popular, say Mugabe Krimora. What is it that you want in this? Look, parliament is tiresome for you. You are it's hot. That was summer. Went to parliament during summer. But the guy is drinking coffee and he's doing so every 2 hours. And so what contribution are you going to give to the legislative agenda of our country? But that's what ZANU had brought to parliament. Most of those old people, they are questioning Billy Mfana. What time are we going? That was the conversation, but it is what it is. Um, and then
There was also
you
a
we
question,
ought
on
to,
SADC, by Mercy.
of course,
Yeah.
I'm going to go to
Okay.
that. So we ought to internally, as a democratic, but that is the democratic culture. We ought to deal with the uncomfortable truths about our successes, uncomfortable truths about some of the failures. That is why people evaluate, and it is not criminal, and it is not secretive that we sit down and say, Papa, Makomana Tagatas. It is not secretive. We can't pretend that we don't do evaluations. We can't pretend that we had a perfect strategy. What we know is that our strategy gave us a victory. We know that. We are happy about what we got, what citizens gave to the Triple C. We are so ever indebted and humbled by the efforts of every Zimbabwean in our path to 2023. So, but we evaluate to say, despite these victories that we had, what is it that we must correct going forward? There are so many things that we must correct, and I know that everyone knows, and citizens also continue to contribute about things that we must do correctly going forward. And we own up all those mistakes that we have made and assist with an agenda to correct them. But one can't weaponize those to try and justify ZANU's illegal, violent, sadistic capture of the opposition through willing tools because of trinkets and trappings of power. The question on SADC, I told you when I was talking about building a critical mass helps such regional bodies to ensure that when SADC brings its report, what are the ordinary Zimbabweans saying about their own destiny? So it must be a coalition, or it must be a collective effort of the position of the regional bodies. We have to exhaust procedurally the Zimbabwean case, goes to Troika, and Troika sets the agenda for the summit, and summit discusses issues. And I think that Honorable Gladys Satchwayo is